Welcome back again, everyone. We hope you enjoyed the music. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat section. هاي الجلسة رح تكون بالإنجليزي بس للتذكير، فللحصول على الترجمة العربية اضغطوا على كبسة الترجمة تحت الشات واختاروا عربي واعملوا ميوت للستيج، وبذكركم إنكم تتفاعلوا أكثر على الشات، بدنا حماس وتفاعل أكبر لو سمحتوا. Now we have a workshop about how can social enterprises raise funds from donors. This workshop will share tips for social enterprises to raise funds through donor funding from international organizations. If you are interested in learning about the importance of networking and how to make sure that funds contribute to the sustainability of the social enterprise, join the workshop in the sessions area with the moderator Yazan Aburrus, the social entrepreneur, media and business development expert. Meanwhile, at the stage, we'll be now discussing decolonizing our space. So, decolonization generally refers to undoing the vestiges of foreign domination and control in a post colonial world. It is concerned with priming thought processes in a way that supports the dismantling of both the physical and the metaphysical aspects of oppressive systems and structures. But what does decolonization mean when colonial systems are alive and at their apex? This panel of dreamers, designers, and believers is gonna give some answers. So let me welcome our moderator, Mahdi Sabbagh. Mahdi is an editor, architect, and urbanist at Columbia University. He's part of PALFest, the Palestine Festival of Literature. In 2019, he created the festival around the theme of urban futures, colonial space today. Mahdi is a PhD student at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. So, welcome, Mahdi. The floor is
Thank
yours
you.
now.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having us today. We're very excited to talk to you about decolonization. Before I introduce our panelists, I wanted to just say a few words about decolonization, what we mean by it, how we're understanding it, and then we'll talk to the panelists afterwards and answer any questions you might have. So I would like to give a few brief thoughts on decolonization as a framework for Palestine specifically, but really it's a global framework, and that's kind of the way that we should be understanding it. So in their seminal essay titled "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor," Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang remind us that first and foremost, decolonization, quote, brings about the repatriation of indigenous land and life. It is not a metaphor for other things, and we want to do to improve our societies and schools. Right, so it's about repatriation of indigenous land and life, and it's not a metaphor for other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. So what they're doing here is they're reminding us that although often coming from the best of intentions, calls for abstract decolonization tend to allow the settler, so in the case of Palestine, that's the Israeli, to evade the real task at stake and to attain what Tuck and Yang call, quote, settler moves to innocence. So what does this mean? This means that certain acts that claim to push for decolonization satisfy the settler's desire to be framed as innocent, and as such allows the settler to remain on stolen land, but now, let's say, absolved of guilt. And this is important, right? This is important to understand. We see this in America when institutions do land acknowledgements, for example. We also see this in Israel. So this year, for example, a study at the university finally admitted that the university was built on the stolen lands Am I? Oh, am I back now? Sorry, I think there was a glitch in the connection. I think I'm back. Okay, I'm back. Great. Okay, so this study at Tel Aviv University finally admitted Oh, I see. Last thing was stolen land. Right. So let me rewind a bit. Basically, this kind of desire, this act of decolonization, this kind of metaphorization of decolonization, frames the settler as innocent, and as such kind of absolve the settler of guilt, right? So, and then an example of this is when American institutions will do land acknowledgements before an event or a show or whatever. And the point is that we also see this in Israel, even though we have colonization as an ongoing, active project in both of those geographies, but in Israel in a very kind of direct, pronounced way. We see this sort of like settler moves to innocence there too. The example I wanted to bring up is that of Tel Aviv University, where a study there this year finally admitted that the university was built on the stolen land of Sheikh Mwannes. And the study's proposal, right, was to pressure the university to both acknowledge this and to memorialize it. Then on Nakba Day, there were other, let's say, well-intentioned calls on the Tel Aviv municipality to rename some streets after the destroyed Palestinian villages that Tel Aviv expanded onto in 1948. Now, both of those efforts might at first seem decolonial, right? But both actually blatantly ignore the fact that the quite basic fact, I think we all know this, that the descendants of Sheikh Mwannes continue to live, in fact, are in camps, and they're a short drive away from their land. And so these are, again, settler moves to innocence, and they're not decolonization. So this isn't decolonization. And ultimately, what Tuck and Yang problematize for us is that decolonization is kind of requires, on a very basic level, it requires this return of stolen lands and really nothing else. So this is important, right, for us to like start on this point. And so the question is, how do we discuss decolonization today in Palestine? Can we discuss decolonization when we are still having to grapple with the reality of the hegemonic Israeli settler state? Palestine, meaning the West Bank, Gaza in 48, continues to shrink, and our resources continue to be plundered, and our lands continue to be taken, and there's no kind of halt in sight of this, right? So while this panel can't promise to provide decolonial tactics, and our wish here is precisely not to metaphorize decolonization, instead, we would like to take a kind of step closer, let's say, and as Palestinians and as spatial thinkers, discuss what decolonization can look like on the ground through buildings, through knowledge of our land, through spatial actions, and through dreaming. And as Palestinians, we ought to never cease to dream about decolonization, even when our daily reality would like us to cease to do so and accept the bleak facts on the ground. So Nishnabeg thinker Leanne Simpson reminds us to not underestimate ourselves, that through what she calls, quote, land as pedagogy, meaning learning with and from the land, her people have found ways to, quote, rebel against the permanence of settler colonial reality and not just dream alternative realities, but to create them on the ground in the physical world in spite of being occupied, end quote. Okay, so on this note, I'd like to introduce our panelists today. First, we have Dr. Nadi Abu Sada, who is an architect and a historian. Nadi is currently at ETH Zurich. He is a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for the History and Theory of Architecture at the Department of Architecture there. Before moving to Zurich, Nadi was an Aga Khan postdoc in the School of Architecture and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Nadi completed his PhD and MPhil degrees at the University of Cambridge and his BA with honors at the University of Toronto. And next we have Zain al-Sharaf, born in Jordan and raised in the UAE. Zain al-Sharaf Wahbe is a London-based Palestinian researcher, designer, and a Part 2 architectural assistant at Wilkinson Eyre. She obtained her Part 1 qualifications in architecture from the University of Edinburgh and Part 2 qualification at the Royal College of Arts in 2022. Welcome both Nadi and Zain al-Sharaf.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mehdi.
So I wanted to start with a question for you, Nadi. And the question is, what did the colonial spaces in Palestine look like prior to the Nakba? And what can we learn from them?
Thank you, Mahdi. Also, thank you to the BuildPalestine team for organizing this wonderful symposium or summit, and also for having a panel on Palestinian space. I think we don't take it for granted that space takes such an important part in a summit like this. I think it's important that this was the choice that the organizers made. And yeah, I want to sort of echo what you said, Mahdi, about the limits of the term decolonization, especially when it is used more as a metaphor and has less to do with the tangible and material realities that we are facing. And this is something we tend to do in academia. We metaphorize things, we come up with concepts, and more often than not, we over-theorize. And by that, I mean that we get to a point where you're writing the theory of the theory of the theory of the theory, and then it becomes a bubble of thinking rather than something that has direct impact on the places that we study and a direct relationship with those spaces. So I just want to echo what you said. It's something that speaks very deeply to me personally, but I think to many of us who sit between academia and practice, and in our case, architectural practice. Regarding your question about decolonial spaces before the Nakba, and I think what you spoke sort of tells us already, it's a sign of warning to me about what decolonization isn't. And I think that's an important first step. But I think here we can also start thinking, okay, what can decolonization actually look like, right? What do we mean when we say decolonization in our own terms, not what the Israelis called as decolonization? And I think there are two main points, at least in my own experience doing research on Palestine for the past few years, that are quite important. I think the first has to do with trying to unpack and unsettle, in a way, histories of colonialism. And by unpack and unsettle, I mean that sometimes, there's this whole talk about writing history against the grain, rereading archives in reverse, etc. But it's also about reading along the grain to try and understand the logics of colonial systems of oppression. And in our case, the logics of colonial planning, architectural interventions, destruction, demolition, all of these procedures, which we know historically date back much longer than the creation of Israel. They date back to the start of Jewish colonization in the late 19th century and later British colonial rule during the Mandate. So we have to have a sense of what their visions were. I think that is a very important first step. And one thing we should keep in mind while doing that research is that we shouldn't overestimate colonial actors and procedures. We tend to do that when we study colonialism, that we tend to think of colonial interventions or colonial administrations as somehow coherent. But sometimes we also need to account for the incoherence of these strategies. I think that's when we start getting a much better sense of the nature of colonial rule in reality, not only in theory. So that all of this, I think, is one element that is almost inevitable in decolonial thinking about urban space, especially from a historical perspective. But I think that only constitutes the very beginning of decolonial thinking. I think a much larger or an equally, actually more important, in my opinion, part is to try and move beyond the colonial frame, to try and reconstruct a narrative of our own understanding of Palestinian urban space and rural space, and not only see it as a counter method. So not only a desire for historicizing anti-colonialism or counter-colonialism, but a desire for understanding what is Palestinian about what Palestinians were doing during that period. Meaning, how were they not only responding to Zionist and British colonial threats, but how were they also creating a vision of their own? And this relates very much to your last point, Mahdi, about how we're capable of creating a vision. And I think Palestinians were very well aware of this, both during the mandate and before, and still are today. I mean, this panel, I think, is a great example of that. One thing that I worked on recently was an exhibition held in Ramallah, actually, and it was based on a research that I did on the 1933 Arab exhibition, which took place in Jerusalem. And the reason I bring it up is because I think it is relevant as an example of how Palestinians were envisioning themselves and their spatial environments before the Nakba. And basically, this was an exhibition of crafts and industries. Like many exhibitions that took place during the early 20th century all around the world, the Zionists had their exhibitions as well. But what's very interesting and important to me about this exhibition, and how then we decided to curate and write its history, is that Palestinians were not merely responding to colonial exhibitions by creating this exhibition. In fact, they did have a vision of their own. And in this case, it was a vision to bring in all Arab countries to participate in an exhibition in Palestine. And so once we sort of stopped thinking about things in terms of, okay, how are Palestinians only responding to the British? How are they responding to the Zionists? But how are they actually building Palestine during the mandate period? We start realizing that the regional dimension, that is the dimension that connects Palestine to the broader Arab and Mediterranean, if you want, region, was equally significant. And this regional dimension is often forgotten when we narrow ourselves to the national frame, which is merely a response to colonialism. So I think my call or my message in this intervention is to try and move beyond the colonial frame and to start to think very deeply, and I think very critically, about what is our own narrative. How do we actually build Palestine? Thank you.
Thank you, Nadi. And for anyone who's in Ramallah and hasn't seen the exhibition, is it still up, by the way?
It is until end of November. Yeah.
Yeah. So the exhibition at the Sakakini Cultural Center is still up, and highly recommend that you go see it. This is great. I want to move to Zain al-Sharaf for the second question, which is basically, so let's just imagine together, right? So after decolonization, what might a post-colonial Palestine look like? And also, why is it important to imagine this now? I think we're so fixated on resolving, on liberating our lands, on resolving the issues that we tend to not think about this at all. But I think Zain al-Sharaf is the perfect person to talk through this question. So.
Thank you, Mahdi. I hope everyone can hear me. I really do appreciate being here, and I'd like to extend my gratitude to BuildPalestine and all the brilliant speakers involved discussing some of the most crucial topics. And thank you, Mahdi, for posing such an important and thought-provoking question. It definitely gave me a lot to think about. And I think it also goes without saying that there are numerous ways to approach this question. And to answer mine, I've operated under the assumption that a decolonial Palestine entails one with a complete withdrawal of the political, military, legislative, and power structures over Palestine. And I think in an ideal circumstance where Zionist leadership is replaced with a largely Palestinian one can anticipate the evacuation and dispersal of the majority of settlers, Zionist settlers, towards cities of Jewish majority or even internationally. Now, having said that, one could consider the question of what aspects of remaining Zionist infrastructures can be dismantled and taken down to begin the process of decolonization. And I think the first one that comes to mind is what hostile Zionist military infrastructures and technologies can be taken down. I guess from right off the bat, I would think of separation walls, watchtowers, checkpoints, and even paramilitary training centers, equipment, artillery and weaponry. The list really goes on. One could also consider taking down hostile Zionist iconography and symbolism, where applicable, from building facades and ornamentations, flags and statues and public artwork, and advertisements, displays, and projections. So these are just some, I guess, categories to consider to start this process. And, these initiatives, which I guess would happen simultaneously, would be followed by the next consideration. What can be partially or completely reconfigured? One would think, namely the layouts and everyday uses of Zionist governmental, institutional, and educational buildings to fit everyday Palestinian programs. And this would entail subtle or quite drastic changes to architectural elements, construction materials, furniture, and landscaping, and other, design elements and categories that would befit traditional and modern Palestinian buildings and households. Another example to consider is redesigning some colonial structures and buildings that were deliberately built over demolished and depopulated Palestinian villages, endowing them with certain characteristics or street names that are emblematic of the time period before the Nakba. And subsequently, another question to ask is what new buildings and building typologies can be incorporated to establish, an irrefutable Palestinian identity and majority. That could be new residences, setting up more agricultural, cultural, and academic institutions, commercial shop fronts, signage, flags. The list is absolutely endless. And this actually brings me to the next point of reclamation. Reclaiming the Palestinian ownership of heritage sites, of buildings, and essentially custodian properties that were expropriated under the occupation. And of course, reinstating their functional and stylistic origins, as Palestinian buildings. I think to cite a few examples, Ruwagh, the Khalil Sakakini Center, and Sakhia, they come to mind when it comes to successfully enacting these kind of interventions and projects. But I think at the end of the day, to achieve these goals practically, I think we need to invest in existing and new architectural and design institutions that could have an emphasis on researching and developing pre-Nakba building typologies, and also adapting them to the present day, to the contemporary setting and contemporary climate. And I think one aspect to greatly account for in such a curriculum is, how can we treat sites of destruction? How can we treat sites of devastation with sensitivity, depending on the extent of the damage? The principles of reconstruction and repair, they automatically come to mind. And I think one practice that does that quite well is the Palestine Regeneration Team, led by Yara Sharif. But, by encouraging more practices and institutions of this caliber to design and build certain, tangible solutions and approaches to what had been damaged and how we can recover that, then we can start to establish a more decisive blueprint of decolonization, in the built environment. And last, I guess my concluding point, I'd like to state that, the Palestinian collective resistance, namely our tenacity to establish our legitimacy against all odds, is actually inseparable to the Zionist colonial project and, its long-standing aftermath. I think it's the very circumstance that awakened my unbridled strength and determination and our unbridled strength to confront the situation in the first place. And I think that this is a legacy that will continue to live through us as a continuation to what our predecessors had very ferociously and rightfully fought for. And I think that's what makes total decolonization quite unattainable, because I don't think we can entirely divorce our narratives, from the perils of the colonial discourses and interventions that shaped us. I think it's very easy to think that we could just start over and eliminate every Zionist influence. But I think this is something to crucially consider, that it's a process of acknowledging what had happened, but also setting up ways to heal from this, to learn from this, and to also reflect on this. So I think that hopefully I covered all my bases to answer this question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. A lot to think about, and it's this is the point of doing this, right? That you have to start somewhere, and I think you're very right to think through the details of this, right? as in like what happens to the towns and cities. How do we, and to not kind of pretend that the settler colonial project hasn't happened, because quite as you said, it was probably impossible to do that, and maybe futile even, right? So yeah, I have another question I'd like to ask both of you, actually. So and you can choose whoever wants to respond first. So the question is, how can Palestinians preserve or resurrect or develop, let's say, new land pedagogies? Again, adopting the term from Leanne Simpson. How can we do this? How can we work on land pedagogies when many of us either no longer have land? So for example, my family in 48, all of our lands were taken, so we can't really be on our lands. But also when the remainder of our lands are in the process of being taken. And I think if any of us think that we're safe because we're in Ramallah or whatever, we're clearly not. Right? If anything shows, if history shows anything, it's that we're not. And so, right, it's like how to work on a land pedagogy without land. This is the question. All right, I will let you answer it now.
I can address this if you want, Mahdi, or
go for it.
Zain, is that okay? Yeah. Thanks for that question. I think land becomes one of the central questions when we talk about cases of settler colonialism. So the Simpson phrase, Simpson, that's her, right? Land pedagogy, I think I think the way you use it is much more useful than the way she uses it, to be honest. Like I went back and read some of what she meant by it, and to me it was repelling from the start. And the reason was that I found it to delve. There's this thing that's very common today in decolonial studies, which is to like mythologize things. Like somehow indigenous people, have their own systems of not, like it's almost an ontological argument for how indigenous people think about the world. And I would like to push against that. And maybe that's a bit provocative, I don't know, but like
please do.
Yeah. Yeah, because to me the question of land is a very material one and has less to do with epistemology and more to do with material reality. And maybe that's my bias as an architect coming into this. I tend to think of this world as material, and my problem isn't how we discursively think about it. But I like Zain's assertiveness. Okay, the land is free. What do we do next? Right? This is a very pertinent question, and I think one that post-colonial nations still struggle with until today. Right? I mean, have people really come out of colonialism? I think when you look at the physical built environment and the racial division of cities, colonial infrastructures, the legacies of those, I think land ownership, all of that is still very much there in many post-colonial places. So I think you thinking already in these terms, Zain, and in the condition of colonialism, I think is quite important, and I think it's something that we should all learn from. And the reason I wanted to push back, Mahdi, against that frame is that I also don't want us to over romanticize what Palestinian land distribution was like before the Nakba, because I mean Palestine was as embedded in the capitalist world order already by the late 19th. So even before the Mandate, by then land was privatized as early as 1858 with the Ottoman Land Code. Actually, that process of land privatization was part of the reason why a lot of the peasants lost ownership of those lands, and then large landowners were then able to control them. So all I'm saying is that what is important for us, if we're thinking in decolonial terms, or if we're thinking to really push the boundaries, is to avoid trying to resurrect the world order as it was before the Nakba. And that's why I think you use the term in a much more interesting way yourself, Mahdi, because the way you framed it is more about, okay, in our case, a lot of the people don't have access to the land. The relationship to the land has been destroyed or cut off in many cases. A lot of the land has been reused. So these are very tangible and pressing questions, which is why I think, yeah, the way you framed it is extremely interesting. And I think maybe there are three main things that we can think about when it comes to land and the question of land. One is the question of agency, and I think these are relevant to decolonial thinking writ large, not only to the question of land. One of the question of agency, like who has agency over taking these decisions over the future of land in Palestine? Are we relegating that to professionals or experts, or are we actually considering this as something that you need popular consensus on? That's one question. The second is, how can we move beyond private ownership as the main framework through which we understand our relationship to the land? And to what extent can we develop collective means to the land and to the product of those lands? And third, and I think, yeah, I mean, I think this is quite important, is if we're talking about return, and if we're talking, I mean, these are things that I assume that we take for granted when we talk about a post-liberation Palestine, right? Again, do we have to recreate, and this is more systematically, the same patterns of land use that existed before the Nakba? And so land use becomes the third category. Like when we start thinking of things like social housing, when we think of our agricultural sector, when we think of all these different elements that have changed a lot, and the fabric of Palestinian society has changed a lot, and vis-a-vis that, our relationship to the land. So I think there are very pressing and very material problems that we have to address, but also we have to think of them creatively, and we can't start with that in a pre-Nakba mindset. I think we have to think of that, of what happened since and all the changes that happened since. So yeah, sorry for the convoluted answer, but I think the question itself is very provocative, and I like that also Zain started pushing us towards imagining a post-liberation future.
Yeah, no, thank you for the answer. And I think Zain Sharaf, I think your next kind of response is it's a perfect time for what you were going to show us also. So, oh, you're muted.
I can't hear you. Yeah.
My bad. I just wanted to say thank you, Nadi, for such a thorough and well thought out answer. It has definitely, given me a lot to think about. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen and just let's give that a shot. Hopefully that will be clear. Can you all see my screen at the moment? I don't know. Oh, wow, that was scary. Okay,
now no.
Okay, I think that should be fine for now. For this, thank you first of all, Mahdi, for this question. And for this specific inquiry, I decided to reframe my personal understanding of land pedagogies as, what it means to really rethink the colonial landscape as a source of knowledge and understanding, and what curriculums can be set in place to enrich our personal understandings of Palestinian historiography, culture, and, specifically in this case, vernacular architecture. And although I've touched on this topic quite generally in my previous question, I think it is crucial to delve a little deeper into, what kind of practical approaches can be developed to achieve decolonization. And, personally speaking, I've never had the privilege to visit Palestine as a second-generation Jordanian. And I think just like many of us, this exemplifies a circumstance where land is largely inaccessible to myself, but also to two generations of predecessors, my grandparents and my grandparents. And this image right in front of you is Al-Manshiyah, and home to my paternal great-grandparents. Al-Manshiyah was a Palestinian neighborhood that was once situated in the north of Jaffa, and it faced a mass destruction under a brutal Zionist colonial occupation between 1948 and the present day. So in this case, I have since yearned to re-experience a Palestinian locality that unfortunately no longer exists. So to confront the dissolution of Al-Manshiyah's urbanity, I've essentially created and developed a restorative cultural project. And it's titled The Image is an Archive. And essentially this project aims to reconstruct the most crucial architectural components of this now absent neighborhood. And these reconstructions were primarily carried out by surveying a myriad of archival resources, rare imagery, primary and secondary resources. But I think more importantly, I've also had the privilege of interviewing one of Al-Manshiyah's last living former residents. His name is Dr. Ahmed Sharkas, and he was born 10 years prior to the Nakba. And my mother was instrumental in connecting us through the Yafa Society in Amman, Jordan. And he provided a meticulous account of his childhood residence. As you can see, the schematic drawing here is actually his, and the associated memories to these different spaces, the living room, the kitchen, the dining room. And I also referred to reference images of pre-Nakba Yafa and Palestinian households in the present day. And I think through our dialogues, we were able to gather so much information and work together to essentially give his childhood residence a second life. And it allowed me to develop these unique methods of archiving and digital storytelling that conventional textbooks and lectures might not necessarily be able to provide us or give us insight into. So I essentially implore all of us practitioners, whether it's in architecture or agriculture or the many disciplines that all of us are engaged in, to essentially continue to extend the barriers or expand on how I guess what is the best way to say this, but how do we preserve and resurrect elements of Palestinian domesticity and culture in multiple different ways? How do we keep the story alive, and how do we engage the last living Palestinian exiles from the Nakba period? And I think that these efforts will contribute to promoting a public multicultural discussion with which to document and raise awareness to the untold Palestinian narratives that essentially remain understudied in mainstream academia. I think that's my kind of take on this. Let me just stop my screen share. Oh, it's done.
Yeah. Thank you so much for these. It's there's a question. I'm looking at some of the questions from the audience, and we might not have time to respond to all of them directly as like separate questions. But one kind of theme that appears there is a question that I think makes a lot of sense, and which is that we're kind of looking. I think the three of us right now are focused on the past in a lot of ways. We're also talking about the future, but is it a distant future? Is it a very distant future? We don't know, right? But we're kind of talking about these two places. The questions are asking us a bit about how do we actually decolonize? Like, how do we liberate our lands, right? How do we end the occupation? How do we dismantle apartheid? And I think I don't want to reject those questions, but I'd like to maybe shift them a little bit by saying that I think there should be another panel that's solely on the very act of reclaiming land, because it deserves that in and of itself. I do want to push back a little bit by saying that it is important to think about the past and the future, and not only as we're not talking about these are ideas. We're not. This isn't the point. Isn't to theorize, right? The point is that there are answers for us. This what we're going through isn't necessarily unprecedented. It might seem that way, but colonialism has a vast history, globally speaking, right? Globally speaking, cultures have been destroyed, erased, ethnically cleansed, genocided. And in studying that past, I think we equip ourselves with ways to cope with what's happening now, and we make ourselves more ready for what is to come. I think this is important. It's important to do that. Now, in terms of thinking about the future, I think, I quite frankly stay up at night sometimes thinking about, are we even ready? If our lands are returned tomorrow, do we know what to do with them? Are we ready to build a decolonial Palestine? And the answer is no, we're not ready, but I think we ought to be ready. And this is why thinking through this now is actually important. It isn't, I kind of almost want to reject this attack on dreaming as futile. I think actually dreaming is productive. It is also healing. And all of us for sure need this right now. So, but Nadi and Zain Sharaf, if you have kind of any last comments on this, I would love to hear them from you too.
Would you like to go first, Nadi, or shall I? I mean, looking back and reflecting, I'm absolutely grateful to have participated at this panel, because it has given us not just the imagination, but also the planning of what could take place if decolonization were ever to happen in the spatial built environment, and our agency as designers and researchers in aiding that process if we're ever going to live to see that day. I think that's all I can say on this. It's such a humbling experience. It's one that I hope would allow more of us practitioners to reflect and support each other. And if anyone ever, wants to collaborate or needs any endorsement for creative projects of theirs, my door is always open. As I said, this is an incredible time to be discussing this. And I think that's all I can say. Nadi, would you like to answer?
Thanks, both Zain and Mahdi. I fully endorse what you said. And I also think that, it's important to highlight here to the audience that we're not people who think that architecture is what's gonna liberate Palestine, Architecture is merely a tool, an instrument for understanding, or architectural thinking, an instrument for understanding the spatial aspects of Palestine's reality, of Palestine's history, of our built environments, of the kind of living spaces that we want to inhabit and live in, both how we did that in the past, how we envision that in the future, but also what kind of practices exist already on the ground today, and we tend to document that. So the question of liberation is primarily a political question, and architecture is merely an instrument to think along that political question. But it's not the answer on its own right, and I think we need to sort of clarify that to also who have less knowledge of what we do as architects or how we approach our discipline. It's not, our intention is not it's not a savior discipline at all. Actually, quite the opposite. Actually, it's more often than not an instrument of power. But it's not only that. And that's why I think a panel like this is important, because personally, at least, I think there's an overemphasis on how architecture can be used to suppress native populations or indigenous people. But architecture is not only that. It's simply a materialization of a vision of how space should be organized. And you can take that in a liberatory way, and you can take that in a suppressive way. And I think what we did today is try to unpack some of the ways in which architecture can express a vision for a different reality, one that is attuned to the needs of humans, to the history of our people, etc. So just on that note. And yeah, I think I really support what Mahdi and Zain said.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Nadi. Thank you, Zain al-Sharaf. Thank you, everyone. This was wonderful, and we're so glad to have shared this with you. Sorry for not getting to all the questions. It's just not enough time. So
Thank you, Mahdi. And
Thank you so much.
thank you, Nadi. Thank you, Zain, for this vital discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So if you still haven't visited the expo area, I highly advise you to do so. You will meet Build Palestine partners and fellow social enterprises, get inspired by their work, and please support them. Now we'll be showing a video of one of Build Palestine fellows, Ahlam Taraira from Vegan in Palestine. So enjoy watching.